Good afternoon. Welcome. It's good to see everybody here today. My name is Cajetan Iheka. I serve as director of the Whitney Humanities Center. I haven't said that in such a long time, and within yesterday and today, I've said it like 5 times, so I'm getting bored of it already. Again, it's good to be here for this event included in our Humanities Now series. This series, tries to think about, the important issues and questions in humanities today that has social and political relevance for, for what's at stake in being human in our world today, at the local level, at the national level, at the planetary level. And I can think of, a better thinker to help us with some of the fundamental questions of our time than our guest speaker tonight. So we're so pleased to welcome you. My role here is very brief. To do the introduction today is my colleague and fellow last year at the Whitney Humanities Center, Jennifer Banks. I'm pleased to welcome her back to the center. She gave a fantastic talk on her work during our fellowship period in the spring. Jennifer is a senior executive editor at the Yale University Press, where she acquires books in the humanities and religious studies. So if you have projects that are relevant, please talk to Jennifer. But after the lecture, not right now. Wait, after the lecture. She's also an acclaimed author. Last year, she published her book, Natality, toward the Philosophy of Birth, which was published by Norton last year. I encourage you to check the book out. There's so much to say about Jennifer, but I'll leave it at that for now. I would just invite you to join me in welcoming Jennifer to introduce our speaker.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay, just give me a wave if I get too quiet. So thank you so much, Cajetan, for the warm introduction, and to everyone at the Whitney Humanities Center for making this event happen, especially Diane Bear-Brown. And thank you, Sumana, for traveling so far to see us today, and to all of you for coming out. It's beautiful fall afternoon. It's such a pleasure to welcome Sumana to the Yale campus. I met her for the first time in person in January in India, and really great to have her here on my home turf. So there's a lot I could say about Sumana. For instance, that she is associate professor of creative writing at Ashoka University. Or for instance, that her poems and novel and nonfiction books have been published across the world and been critically acclaimed in German, in English, Hindi, French, Korean, and soon to be a Spanish edition emerging. But I thought I'd start with instead a little bit more of a personal story about how we met, as an entryway into the two books that we've published together, and the third that's soon on its way. So I met Sumana in a very glamorous place called my Outlook inbox. It's where I meet most of my authors. It's a very crowded but surprisingly democratic place. And so an inquiry came in. It was a lead up to the first full winter of the pandemic, a rather bleak period. There was a hiring freeze at the time, and I had a very full pipeline of books, so I wasn't signing much, and I was kind of having to turn a lot down. But something about the inquiry grabbed my attention, and I think it must have been the title, perhaps, How I Became a Tree. So I read through the email and clicked on the attachment. And I was immediately struck by a voice that seemed to me to jump out of the PDF. This incredibly distinctive and clear voice that was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Sumana had me at her first sentences. She writes, "At first, it was the underwear. I wanted to become a tree because trees did not wear bras." She continues, "I liked too how trees thrived on things that were still freely available. Water, air, and sunlight, and no mortgage in spite of their lifelong occupation of land. I sensed I was in the presence of a uniquely fertile and sharp intelligence. So I published How I Became a Tree in 2021, and readers across the world read it and loved it, discovering upon immersion what one reviewer called a book like a jungle. From the wide sky to sticky leaves and unsightly thorns, everything is included. The book shimmers like silver poplar leaves, another reviewer wrote. But I particularly appreciate what Rena Barman wrote in The Wire, that the book is an ode to all that is unnoticed, ill, neglected, and yet resilient. An observation that points us in the direction that Sumana would soon follow in her next book, Provincials, Postcards from the Periphery, which we've just published at Yale Press this year. The book is, according to a reviewer in the Wall Street Journal, a wise and whimsical exploration of writers and poets from uncool towns in the seemingly stagnant countryside. In Provincials, Sumana's primary concern is no longer the trees pushed to the periphery of modern consciousness, but the people. Challenging the cosmopolitan's dominance, she aims to reclaim the joyful dignity, the genius even, of provincial life. I wanted, she writes in the book's opening, to rescue a people stereotyped for their smallness from a pejorative, to inaugurate an affectionate manner of looking at an ignored people waiting in the modern world's background. For all its playfulness and irreverence, and I'll confess that the book made me laugh a lot, and for all of us Sumana's insistence on smallness, the book's ambitions are big. Sumana challenges us to perceive what we've been taught to ignore, the rich imaginative resources within the people, places, and other life forms that tend to recede into our cognitive background. This reframing of human perception remains at the heart of her next book, provisionally entitled Eaters of Light. So this is a book that's still under development, not out yet. And it'll be a collection of her translated essays from Jagadish Chandra Bose, a Bengali scientist and polymath who developed a theory of plant communication about a century before Western scientists began to confirm his insights with their own research. For most of his career, his work was derided as idiosyncratic and unscientific, and he was denied funding. In translating and publishing his essays, Sumana aims to bring the revolutionary character of his mind and imagination to a world that is still catching up to what he had to show us. And she believes that his work can reshape how we live alongside and inside the plant world. I look forward to getting a preview of that work today. So over the last 4 years, my life and my work have been so greatly enriched by Sumana's insight and artfulness and humor and generosity and kindness. And I'm thrilled that she's here to share her work with the Yale community. So without further ado, I hope you'll join me in giving a warm welcome to Sumana Roy.
Good afternoon to all of you, for making time for me here. To you. I think I'm sounding a bit like Sound of Music now. To Jennifer, to Mary Evelyn, to John, to Jackie, to all of you who've made it possible for me to think of Yale as home now, even though I'm visiting it for the first time. Thank you to Jackie for this marigold garland that she kind of presented to Diane yesterday for today's event. And to Rick Rollins, I hope I have pronounced his name right, the artist who designed this poster. To you too, Meg. Thank you. I've made a PowerPoint presentation for the first time in my life. And, I was thinking, because my imagination is very analogical, I was thinking, would there be PowerPoint presentations or slides in the plant world? And I couldn't think of any apart from their changing from season to season. So if I make a mistake, please do forgive me. There are professors of sciences bordering on the mystical who declare that they can discriminate the character and disposition of anyone simply by a careful observation of his handwriting. As to the authenticity of such claims, skepticism is permissible, but there is no doubt that one's handwriting may be modified profoundly by conditions physical and mental. Such then is the history that may be unfolded to the critical eye by the lines and curves of a human autograph. Under a placid exterior, there is also a hidden history in the life of the plant. Storm and sunshine, warmth of summer and frost of winter, drought and rain, all these and many more come and go about the plant. What coercion do they exercise upon it? What subtle impress do they leave behind? Is it possible to make the plants write down their own autographs and thus reveal their hidden history? This is Jagadish Chandra Bose, the Indian scientist who proved that plants were living beings and who sought to create conditions for plants to write their own script. Torulipi. Toru is plant and lipi is script, so the plant script. It's from his book Obakto, a collection of essays in Bangla that I've been translating for Jennifer for Yale University Press. When new scientific research about plant emotions and plant intelligence became available in March last year, I wrote to Jennifer asking for suggestions about where I could get 2 of Bose's essays published. Essays about a plant's nervous system, plant emotions, and plant intelligence. Jennifer, perhaps as enchanted as I was with Bose's deductions, made 100 years before scientific discoveries about plant intelligence today, asked to see more. All the quotes from Bose's book, including this one, are in my translation. Jagadish Chandra, I would refer to him as Jagadish Chandra and not Bose because, I come from a culture where we refer to each other by their first names more than the second. So Jagadish Chandra was born in what is Bangladesh today. He went on to study the natural sciences at the University of Cambridge and get his DSc degree from University College London, following which he returned to teach at Presidency College in Calcutta. He would eventually establish the Bose Institute in 1917, where most of his research instruments are still preserved. What Bose was seeking wasn't autograph alone. Through it, he's seeking autobiography, the hidden history, the unsaid or bhakto of the plants. Only in this plant script will the history of plants be revealed to us in their own handwriting. What he's trying to create, therefore, is language. If a tree responds to an external injury, how long will it take for this response to materialize? Does the duration of that feeling change in a different situation? Will it be possible to get the tree to write about this time? How does the injury reach the tree's inside? Does it have a nervous system? If it does, how is the speed of the nerve's excitement communicated? Do favorable circumstances cause an increment in its speed? Do adverse circumstances prevent that? Are there similarities between our nervous system and the plant's? Can the changes in speed be recorded by the plant itself? Do plants have muscles like there are in the human heart? In the end, when death comes to a tree, is it possible to record that moment of nirvana? And does the tree respond fiercely to that moment before falling into an everlasting sleep? Only a history of these different moments, captured by different instruments, will give us the true and uninterrupted history of plant life. This again, as you guessed, is Bose. And I love the questions. They are not rhetorical, but they are extremely moving. The urge to discover a language, and I'll speak a little more about it. To record this plant script, Jagadish Chandra Bose would design and create a variety of instruments. The electro-optic analog. I'll just show you some of these instruments. They are from, as you can see from the Bangla script, they are from his book Obakto. So the electro-optic analog, the shielded lens antenna, the resonant recorder, the phytograph, the plant phytograph, the automatic photograph, the bubbler instrument, the plant, I don't know how to pronounce this correctly, I'm not a scientist, sphygmograph, and of course the most well-known among them, the cresograph. I'll return to these again. What I find most moving about this is this particular image. Putting a leaf over there, this was one of the first instruments that he would create. So gradually he would move from the severed parts of the plant to the plants themselves, and recognize that putting a plant or tree under stress wasn't perhaps the best possible way to discover their language. To know the real history of plants, we must go to the plants themselves. Please just keep this in mind, that he's writing this between 1914 and 1922. At the height of European modernism. He has spent his life, a significant part of his life, in England, in France and Germany. He's been touched by the modernist temperament, not just in Europe, but what was happening in Bengal, for instance. And think of Virginia Woolf, the need to write one's own, one's own autobiography, as it were. The emphasis of the modernist temperament to kind of not have someone tell their stories, but for us to be able to tell our own stories ourselves, to import this temperament that we are asking women to, Virginia Woolf asks women to write their own novels, for instance, to import this temperament to what was, in a very dismissive and insulting way called the non-human, or has been called the non-human, for instance, as if, it's India or the rest of the world, that kind of binary. So humans versus non-humans, or humans and non-humans, as it were. But this urge for autobiography, to hear from the plants themselves, is what triggers him to kind of find the plant script. Injury, this again is from Bose. Injury startles every living creature. That contraction is life's response, the response of the living. When one is in the fullness of life, the response is the highest in degree. In a moment of exhaustion, the response is feeble. There's none after death. There is compression in a plant when it is hurt, but it is so little that we are most often unable to see it. The reason we don't see plants move, for instance, from one place to the other. An instrument will amplify this compression and record it as the plant's script. The only hurdle for this is the low intensity of the plant's response, one that the instrument is often unable to script. Its blade comes to a stop. To circumvent this, I was successful in inventing a flat-planed instrument. If two violins are tuned to exactly the same sur, if a string in one of them is stroked, the string in the other will also create a jhankar, which is sound. I didn't want to translate this because the word carries in it the onomatopoeia of a certain kind of sound. In the plant script instrument, which is the torulipi, the iron wires inside and outside it are tuned to the same sur. Imagine this, that both the wires tremble 100 times per second. Imagine this, that both the wires, If the external wire is played, the internal wire will move 100 times and the blade will draw 100 dots. This is how the constant friction with the blade can be avoided. This transcript will record even the finest movement of the plant. This is because the difference between one dot and the next is only a second. The instruments the cresograph, the most well-known of these, the electric probe, the bubbler instrument, the phytograph, again, I don't know how to pronounce this, the plant photograph. These designs are all in his drawings. The cresograph. This is the final version of the cresograph. And all these instruments, I just want to share this with you in an aside, were created by him and a tinsmith called Putiram Das. Because this is colonial Bengal, the British have stopped all kinds of funding for the kind of work that he wanted to do. He had trained as a physicist. He was now working in the field of botany. That too was an aberration that the director of public instructions in Bengal at that time wanted to punish. So all of this, he was working with a tinsmith. And to discover this, I just wanted to share this with you, not because I would be able to explain the workings of these machines to you, but because I feel very moved by them, that it was possible for a scientist to give directions to a tinsmith and create this. So, I remember my father always making a virtue of deprivation, even when we asked him for something and he was unable to give it to us, and saying, passing this proverb to us all the time, necessity is the mother of invention. And I'm reminded of that when I see these instruments. All this was 100 years ago. The quest for the plant script, which is the title of my talk, has continued. And it is this desire to discover the language of plants that defines our zeitgeist of the last 100 years. What does it say about us? It wasn't Jagadish Chandra Bose alone who was searching for a plant script. Rabindranath Tagore, who called Jagadish Chandra Bose his first friend, Amar Prothom Bondhu, was trying to understand Phuler Bhasha, the language of flowers. In one of the many songs, and he wrote more than 2,000 of them, Tagore wrote about the mind, often addressing the mind directly, as in this one, we see his confusion. He's seeking a language of the mind, what the mind has left behind, that it has no peace, that it is forgetful of the path it took so that it cannot return to the same route again. And the speaker tries to listen to the river. And what is the sound of this river? He hears it shiver like leaves. He thinks that he'll be able to find his mind if only he could understand the language of flowers. What is this language of flowers, and why does Tagore turn to it as a metaphor to hold the lack of understanding of the ways of the mind? One notices in the groping for an analogy the same interest, curiosity, and bafflement about this language, the syntax of the mind and the flowering world. It is as if the pathways that the mind takes but cannot retrace, that are its handwriting as it were, is like the language of the flowers, which once in bloom cannot be erased or undone. The translations and paraphrase from Tagore are mine. There are no English translations of these songs in particular yet. Phota, which is blooming, is the foreign language, the blooming of flowers, is the foreign language that Tagore wants to understand. And he repeatedly keeps on calling it a foreign language. So this is a quote from a song. Every day the flowers bloom in your garden. Why don't you feed their honey to my bee-like mind? Tagore wants to understand the language of indifference by contrasting it with the language of favoritism, of blessing and inclusion. That all other beings are blessed by your attention. Why then not me? He begins his song with the language of flowers and ends it with the same. You fill the flowers with fragrance. If I have to identify a refrain of thought in these songs about plant life, it is this: Tagore's curiosity about the language of plants, its script, his acknowledgement that their unique form and fragrance are their language, his desire to understand both the lang and parole, and the impossibility of doing so. We find a record of both the frustration of not being able to learn this language and the acknowledgement of the superiority of the language of flowers in a poem that he titles Phul Photano, Making Flowers Bloom. I'll paraphrase. None of you will be, it's almost like he's speaking to us, none of you, none of us, will be able to make flowers bloom. No matter what you say or how hard you try, whether you lift it up day and night or injure its stalk, you won't be able to make it bloom. You might make it look faded or pale by staring at it constantly. You might tear apart its petals and branches and throw it to dust. Even if the noise and chaos you create might force its mouth open, you won't be able to take its color or rid it of its scent. The one who can make the flowers bloom, he only looks at them. As soon as the rays from his eyes touch their stalks, it's almost like a mantra. He can, only he can make the flowers bloom. His breath makes the flowers want to fly, the leaves become wings, they want to crawl on air. All the colors that bloom like the soul's eagerness, it is as if they are calling someone with their scent. He can only make the flowers bloom. Tagore goes to this language of fragrance like an untrained linguist. What is it that lends to expression, whether as the oral or the written? Importing that understanding of communication as reaction and response, an intuition he shares with his friend Jagadish Chandra Bose, he locates the trigger of this language like the scientist did, in light. But he also goes beyond that, in locating the personality of the intelligence that has created this script. He is seeking both author and intention. What kind of language is this? Mother tongue or father tongue? Where there is flower, there will be plucking. Is that part of its language too? This intuition of pollinator, this other possible end to its life, like its transition to fruit is? Here is Tagore. I've made a mistake in plucking the flowers for the sake of my love. My bride, how will I bind you in my sweet bond? This conscientiousness about plucking flowers, about the sense of it being a mistake, even if it is a retrospective awareness, what is its equivalent in language, besides perhaps it being ungrammatical to life? Language is of course not a valve. There is as much speaking as there is listening. How do flowers listen? Can flowers listen at all? There's the rose in bloom, but don't go there, says the speaker to a bee in a Tagore song. For the sweetness of the rose might lead to injury caused by its thorns. Go to the chapa and shephali flowers instead. Tell them about your grief, your pain. The bee refuses. I won't tell them what I haven't ever before. What lies hidden in my soul, I'll share only with the rose. If sharing it with the rose burns me, I will burn from the wound caused by the thorn. This is an unexpected line of reasoning, a language of the bee that only the rose will understand, or will at least understand better, a secret language whose meanings are only for a very limited and private listener. Is such language a code meant for only specific readers? Are the bees those readers? In all these songs and poems, I notice the same impulse, to understand the flower's script or language as it were, sometimes as bee, occasionally as other pollinators, often analogically as a language system from the human social world, but more often as a language that is outside both our ability to create as well as to understand. In such a vocabulary is the intimation of the creator. Flowers are talkative. They are always in the middle of some manner of conversation in Tagore's poetic universe. I quote, "The flower says that it is blessed to fall on the earth, and then, addressing God, declares that service for God is its home. I was born in the dust, forgive me for that, for there is no dust in my soul." Tagore seems to imply this as a form of communication, the falling of the flowers, their service to the Creator, and then the downcast eyes of the Creator and the concomitant shaking of the branches. Why flowers must fall to the earth? Why that must be part of its language, as if it were the inevitable period in a sentence? How that looks in the plant script is a recurring thought in Tagore, as if the falling of flowers must imply something more. In Ki Phul Jhorilo, a song from the Prem or Love section of Gitobitan, Rabindranath's book of poems, the life of the flower is seen as one of devotion and dedication, and its falling consequently a thing of melancholy. It's a very moving situation. For the flower, a creature indulged by daylight to turn up at night, to be turned down by the night, all because its language or communion is with light, not its opposite. It feels like having arrived into a foreign language. In the song, Flowers That Fall, Je Phul Jhore, there is a seeming equipoise about this. The flower that falls, it falls. Flowers keep blooming, the breeze carries them away, the earth dissolves them into itself. It gives fragrance, it gives smiles, its game is now ended. It's given us love. Is that why it's being ignored? Blooming and falling, these are the two poles between which Rabindranath situates his plant language. It is not completely different from the parenthesis we use to mark the arrival and departure of a human citizen. In a song addressed to the shiuli flower that gives Bengal's autumn its peculiar scent, he, after recording his wonder about the power of the night, its lack of light that produces this fragrance, asks, Kon bhashaye chash bidai? In which language do you want us to say goodbye? He, like his friend Jagadish, wants the flowers to respond, whether it's asking them for the language of preference in which to hear goodbyes or their names. Hey Bideshi Fool, he asks a foreign flower in a poem, what is your name? Smiling, it shook its head. I understood that it has no use for names. Its identity was its smile. For every question it is asked, the foreign flower has the same answer, a smile. In the end, Rabindranath gives in to his obsessive curiosity. Hey flower from abroad, I whispered into its ear, what is your language? Smiling, it shook its head, and the leaves murmured. I said, I know, it's the Bani, the speech of fragrance my breath has filled with the language of your breath. How then do we read the language of non-flowering in this flower linguistics, if you allow me to coin this phrase? Through this language, he, like his friend, is also seeking Fuler Itihash, a history of flowers. Through a conversation between a honey collector and a flower, Rabindranath seems to imply that the human and the wind are monolingual. They speak in a language that the flower has to understand, but they in turn have not bothered to understand the flower's language. They cannot see that the flower has exhausted itself through its generosity, that it is wilting, that it has nothing left in it to give anymore, not even to itself. Its death, the death of the flower, is the loss of language. The human does not, it cannot understand the language of flowers, their codes, their semiotic, their index, their lack of consent. No one asks a flower whether it can be plucked. It is a compulsive tick in writers to hear things in quotation marks. When I read Rabindranath, I sometimes wonder whether he saw the blooming of flowers as direct speech, flowers as beings whose expressions must exist inside quotes. He, of course, doesn't say this anywhere. These are my slightly wayward thoughts. But his permanent sense of wonder about who is responsible for the blooming of flowers leads to the inevitable thought, Eto fool ke fotalo kanone, who made all these flowers bloom in the forest? Whose language is these flowers in bloom? What does it mean? That the flowers are a response to or are in communication with the seasons annotates his understanding of this language, so that it seems that this is a dialogue, perhaps even slightly Socratic in nature. Badolo diner prothomo kodomo fool, koreche dan. The first kodam flowers of the season are a gift. I have come to offer the songs of Strabon. The serve and volley between the season and the flowers is endless and infinite. The human, feeling deprived of this language, wants to change the dialogue into a discussion, hence their intervention through singing the songs of the rainy month of Shravan. And then the parallels between the response of the flowers and the human. The rains cause an outpouring of song in him, as they do on the branches filled with flowers. Flowers as song, as sur, musical notes, another language, but one that can do without a script. Almost as an aside, I want to share with you this page from the artist Nandulal Bose's lessons for his students. He's trying to teach them rasa theory, a theory of art emotion from 4th, 5th century India. Before this, he's shown them an analogical relationship between plants and humans. So, when you draw the scars on a tree trunk, for instance, he tells them that you must draw ears. So this is what the scars in the trunks of plants look like. Here, he's using shapes of branches and leaves and flowers to represent various human emotions. So this is the rasa theory, and notice how we would have seen or plucked or gathered from below a tree or a forest shapes of branches and flowers and buds and so on. Leaves do not fall like raindrops. There is no discernible order. Not one will fall like the other. It is as if even in falling, the leaves want to retain their signature. I didn't mean to use the word signature. It just came to me. For it feels like this, leaves falling from the same tree, but differently, as if it is not just the moment of birth that marks our uniqueness, that we should be different in our death as well. E. Cummings tried to find the emotion in this script of the falling of a leaf in this poem. This poem is, a leaf falls with loneliness. So you see, a leaf falls, and then if you take out the parenthesis, it's loneliness. A leaf falls with loneliness, and yet in this script, we find it in company, sometimes one letter, sometimes two, sometimes even three. This one particularly ironic, for it has the word one, but there are 3 letters there. There are many L's in the poem. They are the inaugural sounds of both leaf and loneliness. Even when they fall in company, these leaves, they are all alone, lonelier than they were on a branch. That is why E. Cummings's poems is a deconstructed branch. The leaves are together, but they are not connected by any glue, such as the branch, almost the way letters are and are not in an alphabet. It's interesting that Cummings turns to the last phase of a leaf's life when he thinks of a plant script, though of course he does not use the word. Octavio Paz does the same. His poem is titled Coda. Perhaps to love is to learn to walk through this world, to learn to be silent like the oak and the lindel of the fable, to learn to see. Your glance scattered seeds, it planted a tree. I talk because you shake its leaves. Paz borrows a few things from human language. First, the oral, silence. To learn to be silent like the oak and the lindel of the fable. After silence, which is of course the first letter, invisible though it is of any alphabet. Then the dispersal of sound in that silence, your glance scattered seeds. It's almost as if a script is coming into being. And then that unforgettable sentence, I talk because you shake its leaves. The movement from silence to speech, mediated as it is through plant life, ends with the shaking of leaves. In E. Cummings's poems, the falling of leaves created a script of loneliness. In Paz, it is dialogue. One talks, the other shakes its leaves, another plant script. The analogical imagination about the language of plants is older than the written script. It is perhaps for this reason that when the script emerges or begins to emerge, particularly the page and binding, languages begin reflecting this. What else can explain why the Bangla word for leaf and page are the same? Pata. Similarly with Hindi, panna derives from the Sanskrit parna, meaning leaf. In Gach Kotha Bole, trees speak could also be translated as trees can speak or trees do speak. The Bengali poet Shakti Chattopadhyay writes, this is in my translation, I sit inside the tree morning and evening. I water every tree. The tree gives me fruit in return. This give and take continues in gentle, unspoken love. Trees and man understand this love. No one else does. I sit inside the tree morning and evening. Not everyone is a tree. There are weeds too. They have to be plucked out with some strength, a little care. The trees live happily. To be able to live happily, the trees look at them with indifference. It hurts to pluck out weeds. They too bear flowers. They might not be upper caste like the sunflower or the jasmine, but even then, they have squatted in our garden with love. Without our giving water, they are giving us flowers of so many shapes and colors. So that trees can thrive and live happily, we pluck out weeds. I sit inside the tree, morning and evening. A few thoughts about plant language here. The need to sit inside a tree to be able to understand its language better. The need to sit there morning and evening when it is watered. A form of close reading that is predicated on reciprocity and response. The poet wants us to notice the weeds that give us flowers even without our watering them, and in doing so, exist outside the expected script of response. The human's response to these flowers in this dialogue is weeding. What we are being given, even if only in the likeness of a moral, is the difference in the character of two kinds of scripts. One that flowers through serve and volley, watering and flowering, the other through neglect. In other words, the maturity that comes from practice, say as in calligraphy, versus a child's handwriting. There's also the other related question. Is weeding a form of writing, of scripting? Is it akin to eraser, of striking out, of wiping out with an eraser? A script is a living thing. I repeat this cliché only to emphasize that it is only the living that can have a script. It's interesting then to discover that so many poets have spent their creative and speculative energy on imagining the likeness of a plant script, without using the phrase, of course, in the final stages of a plant's leaf, particularly the falling leaf. I'm not going to read this entire poem. I've just shown you a few poems about the falling leaf. This one is just the opposite. I'll just ask you to look at the last lines. I'll take it, the tree seems to say, a new slick leaf, unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it all. The obverse of the script of the falling leaf is the new slick leaf, unfurling like a fist to an open palm. As Ada Lehman writes in her poem, Instructions on Not Giving Up. It does feel like a miracle how it emerges from hiding, at first a pixel of green, gradually growing into a bubble and then a spire, all of these in miniature, and then into something like cloth, its edges even and uneven, a slight curl or wave, as if responding to an invisible history of time, trauma, and tentativeness. There is more surprise in the leaf script than in the script of buds and flowers. The bureaucracy of budding and blooming, necessary as they are to the continuation of the life of a species, is a bit like passing an examination. One must write within the margins. With leaves, the script is freer. With leaves, we see a script like we see letters of an alphabet, a community, a neighborhood, a hamlet, a joint family living together, but also separately. Hence the greening, the green skin, the patience, the plodding, almost an imitation of how the script is written. In April 2023, nearly 2000 years of the urge to find the language of plants was collected by Katie Halton in her book, The Language of Trees, a rewilding of literature and landscape. The book begins with what Halton calls a tree's typeface, a rewilding tool. On the left page is the tree alphabet, its name almost a continuation of a quest that began with Bose's plant script. Halton, an artist, has chosen a tree, more specifically its shape for each letter of the alphabet: apple, beech, cedar, dogwood, elm. So you see here, I'm not going to read out the names of all the trees. I list these common nouns in their obvious alphabetical order to emphasize something. What happens when I put this sequence of trees in a sentence? Why do most of us feel the urge to get to the end of the sentence in a way we might not necessarily if it were a sentence packed with the names of, say, Nobel Prize winners? Halton does not choose A for apple because it is easy and obvious. She chooses it for its form, for the visual resemblance between the structure of a generic apple tree and the letter A, turning a private manner of seeing into a very public typeface. Halton is an artist. Bose was a scientist. Bose's understanding of this language was through response, which is how plants and indeed our muscles and bones find form. Halton is recording form as well, but their positions on the arc are different. Bose wants to know the reason. Halton records without question. Bose wanted to see this as autobiography and by extension history, plant history, world history. Halton, with her eyes on effect, not cause, records the bones of what she sees. The Roman script on the on the right page, the tree script on the left. Crowded when it's a long excerpt, almost analogous to a forest, spaced out when it's a single sentence excerpt, almost like a park hedge. My favorite page is the tree alphabet version of the page of contents. This one, for instance, seeds, soil, saplings. So this is written in, of course, the Roman script, but also in Halton's script. So seeds, soil, this is how the list of contents goes. Seeds, soil, saplings, buds, bark, branches, leaves and trunks, flowers and fruits, forests, family trees, tree time, tree people, roots and resistance, after trees. After noticing the obvious division of the book into its constituents as if it were a tree, evidence of a heightened analogous imagination between the human and the plant that marks our times. I myself am guilty of this in my book, How I Became a Tree. You notice the language, the alliterations, seeds, soil, saplings, buds, bark, branches, flowers, fruits, forests, family trees, roots, resistance. And you wonder whether this poetic device that has been used for millennia could actually be the language of trees. Something else caught my attention. The use of and. I don't have it here, I think. So, you know the mark that we have on our keyboard to use and, for instance. Halton uses a tree face for and that does not belong to the tree alphabet that she has created. It resembles the shape of a V, a tree trunk, connecting two branches like the conjunction in a sentence does. Does plant life know that conjunction? Where can we locate the and mark in the form of a tree? Unlike Rabindranath, I went to the leaves to identify every kind, type of leaf as a letter of the alphabet requires a willed imagination. I think at first it was the heart, hearts for leaves, tiny, tiny hearts crawling up a stem. Sometimes it seems that they mimic the raindrops. They remain close to the earth like little people, unambitious for height, distrustful of the vertical. They will take over any place that is given to them. They are like the heart, which can accommodate everything and everyone. Hearts whose chambers we cannot see, hearts connected by string-like stems, so many of them, these heart-shaped leaves, so many of them, light green when young, maturing into a darker color when older, the opposite of human hair which goes lighter as we age. When hung in pots, they pour out of it in abundance, so that from a distance they might resemble a leaking pot with water sprinting out of it. I collected them when they dried, or when birds tore the stems and left them behind. Since it was the shadows of the tiny hearts on the walls that had at first seemed like a script whose meaning we were still trying to decipher, it was to them I went. Coating its dead branches and leaves with black watercolor paint, I pressed them on white paper. But I am not the sun. My pressure is not weightless like light. If a plant is exposed to sunlight unequally, it will reveal itself in the differences in shape and color. But even as I tried my best to distribute pressure equally on the paint-coated plant, the results were disastrous. I mean, they were wrong. The script was more a record of both my body and mind than it was the plant's. If the plant had wanted to write, it would have. Why was I, like a parent or school teacher, forcing the script on a species, on a world which had neither any urge nor use for it? But I was stubborn, and I was restless. Having no training in making art, I had no idea about waiting time. I moved the books under which I had placed the paint-soaked plant. What had I expected? Why had I expected to see something resembling shadows of these plants? What I had instead was something like a sea beach full of footprints or an ant trail, or crows on an electric wire. It is only now that I see that my first spontaneous comparisons were with animals. The leaves had had no desire to write. I was only trying to record their form the way an ink pad smeared fingerprint is a record of my finger. Was I my finger? Was the page filled with my fingerprints my personal alphabet of 10 letters? Why then was I taking the form of the leaves to be a script? How was one to read it? Left to right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top? What? As I tried to record or imagine the plant script, I began to notice the arbitrariness of our language systems. Who had decided on these orders of looking and observing? Should I look at a tree from its roots to its top, or top down? There was another reason for the confusion. The impress of the leaves both looked and did not look like a script. By script, I am thinking of something that has emerged from the human. There was also something else. The patterns on the piece of paper were, I find it hard to say, were actually analogous to a death mask. In other words, this was a death certificate. The leaves had been dead, its movements a thing of the past. This could not be a record of response, which is how I understand language. As a phrase I've been using, the serve and volley between our circumstances and ourselves, moving as they often do between our registers of aha and ouch. My experiments were childish, or, if I have to be a bit more generous to myself, a bit like a child's trying the letters of an unfamiliar alphabet, letting the leaves and branches dry, picking them up from places, coloring them, pressing them on paper. It did not take me very long to realize or come to accept that mine was, like Bose's, a death script. I tried not to blame myself, for I had tried to let living leaves and branches leave their impress on white paper. Apart from the fact that it felt like I was asphyxiating them by dipping them in color, even if it was watercolor, there was the problem of dimension. It was impossible to reduce living forms onto the flatness of paper. This made me wonder about the idea of script itself. How can a script, any script, hold my being, our beings in it? Language and script are living things. When it is not alive, we find the cliché, dead language. Was this a plant cliché then? Even if it wasn't the plant's cliché. Even if it wasn't the plant's cliché. It was ours. I had to suppress my proclivities. No, the response of plant life to spring wasn't the equivalent of an exclamation mark. Neither was a fallow period of non-flowering a period. Punctuations derived far too much from the human body, from our reflexes and reserve. The anatomy of plants is different. Language, all kinds of human language, the script, drawing, music, numbers, was inevitably and compulsively synecdoche. It is impossible to think of plant functioning in terms of the grammar of the synecdoche, the part for the whole. I had tried with living plants and branches. There's a disobedience in the form that doesn't commit to two-dimensionality, which is after all what the script is. That is why shadows are not our reflections. I became, by Plato's indictment, twice removed from the truth when I started taking photos of the shadows. I have no reasons to offer. Why did I think of plant shadows as script when I have never imagined my own shadow or the shadows of animals as our script? I'm embarrassed. What was I trying to understand as form? The anatomy? What was the plant script and what did it mean? This urge to imagine and ascribe literacy to plants. The shadows of branches triggered mental games with oneself. How they resembled certain letters of the alphabet. A, think of the branches, the shapes of the branches. A, W, M, N, H, K, L, T, V, and of course Y, the most common form. My thoughts do not have any meaning. They have no consequence, no trajectory, nothing. But they are not idle either. What did it mean to force similarities of an alphabet between two species, one much, much older than the other, much older than us? It was silly, of course, and yet it was impossible to deny this urge to find a shared grammar of existence, for what else is language? I noticed the way rain fell on plants and trees. There was a script there, as temporary as a child's slate, vanishing and changing quickly, but it was a script for sure. I tried to check whether the raindrops fell similarly on humans. But humans and plants get wet unequally. I had to pause the thought. There were others who were looking for other plant scripts to read. Scientists were now reading plant rings to study the history of pollution, like Sylvia Plath had found the history of winters soaked and seeped into this script once. The wet dawn inks are doing their blue dissolve. Just notice, please, the ing sound and how it behaves like, a record player, as it were, the ing sound. The wet dawn inks are doing their blue dissolve. On their blotter of fog, the trees seem a botanical drawing, memories growing, ring on ring, a series of weddings. The urge to hear from the other side, which is what Bose wanted, and not about the other side, has changed the idea of the plant script. Botanical art, a manner and mannered way of seeing plant life, whether as a species or its constituents, is no longer unidirectional. It is no longer a record of the human looking at the plant. The quest for the language of plants, for its script, is now an investigation, in the way all art is an investigation, into how and whether the other force, so far the non-actor, the plant itself, could create art. Like Bose tried to record the response of plants to external stimuli, artists want to record the autonomous behavior of plants or their paths to the elements. Art, therefore, is now about trying to understand the behavior of the plants, even as artists, behaving like scientists, put them in unexpected situations. Isabel Hofmeyr, an academic who has been writing about the need to inflect the humanities with an awareness of the elemental, has turned to a technique called GASP, G-A-S-P, naming her first exhibition after it. Broadly a form of botanical printing where plant matter, whether paper or fabric, is brought in contact with heat through steaming or boiling, so that the heat transfers the pigment of the leaf onto the substrate. The heat changes or wrings the juice from the leaf, leading to the formation of a halo or gasp at the stem, which is what you see. Hofmeyr's urge to discover a vocabulary of plants has led her to move between paper and fabric as the recording surface. Paper rolled on tin, tied up with string and then boiled with onion skin, eucalyptus and rusty nails. The fabric was mordanted with alum and iron and then tightly rolled up with the leaves and steamed. Plant art, therefore, seems to have become an expression during stress and strain. I do not mean to suggest that plant art is predicated on the Keatsian notion of our sweetest songs coming from our saddest thoughts. And yet most of these processes of getting plants to speak or write or paint involve putting them under stress or pain and even moving them towards their death. Anna Atkins in the 19th century, before Jagadish Chandra Bose and other artists in quest of a plant vocabulary, was making cyanotypes of botanical life. Using Herschel's method, she would lay algae or algae on paper coated with ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferricyanide. Exposure to sunlight and a wash in plain water would lead to the uncovered areas of the paper turning into a moving melancholic blue. This blueprinting process would give us a plant script of various kinds of algae on the British Isles in the 19th century. That scientists and artists are recording the zeitgeist of the times can be seen in the register of emotions all of them are trying to capture, whether in the laboratories or on a canvas. David George Haskell, who has made scientific investigations with the improvisatory instinct of an artist, has been recording sounds inside tree trunks. I listened to the recordings and I'm going to play a few of them for you. It's the sound of water, but not the genre we associate with nature, not the gurgling of stream, not the whistling of vapor from a pressure cooker, not of rain, nor of water splashing at one's feet. What is this sound? I listen carefully. Haskell's recording of what the root hears feels like footsteps. And this is what he says. I've sped up the first part of the recording by 4 times so that we can hear we can hear the sound of the footsteps. Let me play some of this for you. So you see, this is a twig gaining in volume with each day. And this one, how rain falls differently on different species of plants. Isn't that phrase lovely? Botanical drumskins. And at the end, let me play this. The roots of a palm tree. Here. Instagram has many videos of what is called plant wave technology, where biorhythmic sounds inside cacao and jackfruit sound like music, tapping, acoustics, and play. The plant script exists, only that we are still illiterate, even though we are like kindergarten children who believe that every scribble and every line is a letter in the alphabet. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. So much to think about there. I want to open up the to some questions with the time that we have left. Well, if you have questions, you want to raise your hand.
Hi, thank you for a beautiful and really inspiring and insightful talk. I am really curious about what you think about science and the way that science sort of uses this method to collect data, and data then becomes the language. You know, it becomes the language that scientists use to understand the plant. And I understand that, you know, science sometimes requires, it's a quite invasive, you know, sometimes it requires, like you said, you know, killing the plant often, but I'm just wondering, you know, in the concept that you put forth of language and script, where does the scientific data fit into this as language as well?
And you are?
My name is Morelli.
Hi, Murali. Thank you. And it's a question that occurred to Jagadish Chandra Bose, for instance. And let me try to answer this first from his perspective before we come to our own times. My discovery of Bose as a, you know, as someone who could be an emotional and intellectual relative, someone who was dead, of course, by the time I was born, came from the fact that during a faculty council meeting in a college where I used to teach before, a long time ago, a physics professor who quite obviously did not like me very much said that, you know, you are like Jagadish Chandra Bose. You don't have children, and that is why you are Gaj Pagal or mad for plants. And that was the moment I discovered that, oh, he did not have biological children of his own like I don't. And that kind of made me look at his work, and I had not read his research. I obviously knew about him, had read a little of his work, but not his research. As I read more and more of his research work, published both in English and Bangla, and he was very particular about publishing his work in Bangla, because he wanted, you know, Bangla to be a language of science, which was what it wasn't accepted as a language of science at that particular point of time. And the more I read, the more I discovered that he likens plant life to infants. Whether that had to do with what this physicist, my colleague then, was kind of making this association, oh, because you don't have children, so, you know, you're imagining plants as children. Whether that is true or not is not for us, or not, at least certainly not for me to find out. But in the case of saplings, he would often refer to them as infants. Now, towards the end of his life, he would confess again in a very human and humane manner that he had probably made a mistake in trying to record the plant script by putting the plant under a lot of stress. The external stimuli that he was forcing on his plants were heat, so some of these plants had to kind of feel the fire, as it were, and immediately they would die. Heat, hot water, extreme cold, electricity. So he came to terms with the fact that the script that he had created was one that couldn't really have been a script. It was one that had been created under stress and distress, which is not the only language that we speak, for instance. When he's writing about his nephew, who's very young, in a paragraph towards the end, he says that school teachers in Bengal have often been successful in, how do I say this, have often been successful in making great lawyers and judges of their students and sending them to, you know, finding them jobs in the Calcutta High Court. And this they have achieved by pulling the children by their ears. You know, obviously some kind of punishment. And he says, I am guilty of the same. So it is possible, and he makes a distinction between the human and the plant in this particular manner, that it is possible that a school teacher has punished a child who has gone on to become very successful. But the same is not true of plant life. If I punish it, I will not get the kind of record or autobiography that I am seeking for it. Yours is a question that obviously comes from ethics. Right? I mean, am I right in causing distress to these plants and so on? Isn't that the slant of your question?
My question more is geared towards why. my question is more geared towards why there seems to be this divide. Why can't numbers also be a form of language, even if understanding the plant via collecting data, it doesn't always have to be invasive or painful for the plant. Sometimes it can just be observational even, that is a form of gathering numbers,
Sure.
But I found that in using science as a method towards understanding plants, and getting into a deeper relationship with them in this way, I almost sometimes feel that I have to almost find new language to understand these very, small scale interactions or small scale new things that I'm learning about the plant using the scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious how that fits in, how numbers fit into the script.
The language of numbers is obviously a particular language, and yes, even in Bose, there is obviously he's trying to quantify all these instruments that whose images I shared with you are instruments that quantify growth, response, how many times does it respond within the space of a second or a minute. He never goes to a minute. He doesn't have those kind of instruments to record. So all of this, I absolutely agree that yes, it is the language of numbers should be a valid a way of understanding not just plant but any form of life. But in this particular case, my interest is in trying to understand what does it say about, it's not so much about the plant alone, but what does it say about us? Why are we so obsessed in trying to understand a language which we have actually, our understanding of the script, of language, my purposive use of lang, parole, intentionality, close reading, is only importing the spirit of the times that we live in. Why this compulsive urge? It's almost become a tick. Why not let it remain a foreign language? Why are we... So A for apple could be A for aspen for you, right? O for oak for Jennifer could be O for orange for Jackie. So this is, of course, a very private script, and that is why I said a private script with a public typeface. There should be and will be, I'm sure, different ways of understanding plant life. My interest is why this urge? I don't have an answer. And so response for Bose, as Jennifer said in her introductory note, Bose is interesting to us 100 years later, at least to someone like me, not because he is a scientist. I'm not going to use a word like mayor, not because he's a mayor scientist, not because he's a scientist alone, but because he's a philosopher of life. He understands response as a sign of the living. He's a physicist who's walking on the footpath, on the pavement in Calcutta, when, this is folklore, it's not substantiated, he hasn't written about this anywhere, when he ends up touching the touch me not, and the leaves freeze. And this is, so long people have been saying, following Aristotle and whatever, that this is not living. But this is a living thing. In cultures such as the one that I come from, that exist, in Africa, in Australia, in India, and elsewhere, this would have been a given, to consider plants a part of the living world. But he had to prove this to a world which would not accept it. So every time I say plants, he proved to the world plants were living beings, it seems almost like a tautological thing. Why do I need to keep repeating it? I also want to say that science is necessary, and it's a scientific moment or a scientific breakthrough that kind of triggered me to explore this thought. As I said to you right at the very beginning, scientists in Tel Aviv in March 2023 in a journal called Cell published that plants cry when they are not watered for 2.5 days or something. And when Bose had said this, the editors of the Scientific American had mocked him and called him mumbo jumbo. It was this moment, I had already translated this, and this discovery led me to share this with Jennifer, who recognized that something revolutionary had happened 100 years ago. So it is this moment of the conjunction between, see, I see it like this, that science and art and literature and everything work in conjunction. I say this to my students often, that there's a reason that your phone is called an iPhone. There's a reason it only opens to your fingerprint, because we are living through through a time of extreme individualism, ruthless individualism. It is not a Wii phone anymore. It is an iPhone for that reason. So it has been called an iPhone not just because it's catchy, but it is able to hold in it the temper of the age. So that is the moment that I want to investigate.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Okay, let's take all three of them at once, and then we'll give Sumana a chance to respond.
Thank you so much. I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about the universality of imagery and play, and I love that you ended with kindergarten, children's voice. I work with children, and I'm inspired by the preschools of Reggio Emilia, and one of which was named after Bruno Minari. And his Drawing a Tree is a wonderful book that I have enjoyed, and I'm just seeing a lot of connections to what you're talking about, especially the alphabet. So I was wondering if you had engaged with his work, or if you have engaged with children a lot. Thank you.
I am familiar with his work, but I haven't really... Oh, you want me to answer later?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Let's take all three. I saw another hand here somewhere.
Thank you. I was wondering, the discussion has really been about your research into someone proving that plants are part of this physical world. And so I was wondering, coming from an indigenous background, that across many communities, we believe that plants hold a spirit,
yes,
and they can assist in addressing our own spiritual afflictions. So I was wondering what you thought of the spirit of a plant.
Thank you for this question. I was hoping someone would ask me.
Thank you. I was just thinking about plants and their communication through mycelium, and I was curious about whether some of your work has extended into sort of the fungal world.
Thank you, Jackie. I'll try to answer your question first. I'm familiar with his work. I have not engaged with it intellectually. About working with children, I have a nephew and niece, so we try to talk about plant life and, drawing and so on. One of the things I discovered while trying to research, not in a professional capacity, but just landing upon it by chance, is the film director Satyajit Ray. When he was a child, he was sent by his mother to Shantiniketan, Tagore's university, where he was told by Nandalal Bose, the person, remember those emotions, the branches. So he was Satyajit Ray's teacher for some time. And Nandalal Bose told Ray that he had been drawing a tree in an incorrect way all his life. So this is what he said. He said the Europeans draw a tree from top to bottom. So this is what, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, this is what was told. He said other cultures, whether Japanese or African or Indians, we do not draw trees like that. We draw a tree as it grows from the ground to the top. So different cultures of drawing trees even, how do you draw a flower? Where do you start? How do you start? For instance, the mango. I remember this because you asked about children. I remember my husband trying to teach my nephew to draw a mango. And so my husband was always beginning from there, where the stalk is or used to be. And my nephew would always start from the bottom. So one could never be sure, about beginning and end and teaching children. But I want to say you're very fortunate to be able to, bring your world and theirs and this cohabitation. One is always learning from them. I think I learn more from them than they do from me, particularly about the plant world, the questions they ask about light and eating light and so on, about the spirit of plant life. Much before I discovered Bose, we had to come back home before 6 o'clock from the playground. And one day I remember asking my mother, why? And she said, even trees go to sleep by then. So it was a given that, I remember in Germany, for instance, every time I have tried to talk about plant life or stones or the elements, it's always the word that has been used to characterize what I am saying is animistic. And cultures that we come from, we don't even make this distinction. It's already there. You don't say this is animistic. You take it as a given that there is life and spirit in everything. So I hope my husband is here and he scolds me for this very, very much. Sometimes if I hit against a stone, I end up saying sorry to the stone, even though I feel I have been hurt by the stone. But I have also hurt the stone. So I have no sense of anything. So, when I fight with him and I'm very angry, I will throw my phone on the bed. After some time, I will go and say sorry to the phone. So I have a sense of everything having soul and spirit. I realize I'm in America. So I realize it might be confused for mumbo jumbo, but it is something that has brought me calm. And I would like to believe that there is spirit and soul in every form of living. Jackie's question, yes, the World Wide Web, Wood Wide Web, and just, I think, was I speaking to John about this? No, I was speaking to, what's his name? Shivi. And we were discussing Susan Simard's work in the morning. And so to be aware of this form of intelligence, going on a highway in India where all the trees are being cut, and suddenly to discover, pointing out to a friend or my husband, look, this tree was cut, but it's growing again. To discover that its neighbors have been giving it IVF, as it were. That idea of community. So, yes, it does inform some of the things that I have. This is part of maybe 18 or 22,000 word thing that I shared with Jennifer, out of which I could only, share maybe 4,500 words or so with you. It's fascinating, isn't it? The mycelial world, yes.
Thank you so much, Sumana. Please join me in thanking Sumana Roy.